Good morning, everybody, and welcome. My name is Henry Sobenet. I'm the Senior Vice Chancellor and Chief Financial Officer at the Colorado State University System Office. We are so excited today to do a little bit of a relaunch of the Colorado Futures Center, and CSU is proud to be a supporter of the center. On a personal note, it's interesting to be in a new role relative to the center. Many years ago, I was a researcher on a big project the center was doing while it was housed at University of Denver. And though the center's been a little bit dormant for the last couple of years, our hosts, our presenters today and leadership of the center are going to tell you what they've been working on. And this is the latest iteration of that. This is the ColoradoCast, which is a new quarterly forecast designed to fill a gap in the suite of forecasts produced in Colorado. It only has a forecast horizon of 6 months, and most forecasts go out a year, 2 years, 5 years. So we feel like the forecasting space was missing this short-term kind of real-time index of economic activity and where the Colorado economy might be going. So our presenters today are Phyllis Resnick and Jen Newcomer, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about them and then turn it over to them for the presentation. Dr. Phyllis Resnick, I should say, is the co-founder of the Colorado Futures Center, and she is currently the executive director and our chief economist. Her reputation around the state is very high, and we're so proud to be affiliated with her and her research. Her most recent research focuses on macro and fiscal forecasting, fiscal sustainability, economic impact analysis, the political and economic distributional effects of fiscal rules such as tax and expenditure limitations. Over the years, her fiscal forecasts have been integral to budget decisions for Colorado, Hawaii, the cities of Boulder, Arvada, Denver, and Aurora, transportation here in Colorado, and public utilities such as Xcel Energy. Phyllis's educational background is impressive. She has master's and doctoral degrees from CU Boulder and CU Denver, respectively. And she has been recognized appropriately with awards for both her domestic research and international work, including the prestigious Most Distinguished Research Award from the Governmental Research Association and the Volunteers for Economic Growth Alliance Volunteer of the Year Award. Jennifer Newcomer, joined the Colorado Futures Center as our research director in April of 2020. Prior to joining the center, Jennifer directed Shift Research Lab at the Piton Foundation. Her portfolio there focused on providing reliable data and neighborhood level research to organizations and communities across Metro Denver. Over that period, there were partnerships over the years with the Futures Center. Shift's research addressed social and built environment issues, household and neighborhood life cycles, housing affordability, and the forces impacting family economic well-being. With this portfolio and the center's original macro focus, Colorado Futures Center is poised to undertake the next generation of research in partnership with CSU. And so we're hoping that our economic and socioeconomic research can contribute to finding more ways for students to achieve their economic vibrancy. And that's such a great overlap with the baseline work of CSU, but also the work of the center. So with that, it's really my honor and a personal privilege to turn this over to Phyllis and for her presentation. And once again, a welcome to everybody. Thank you for taking time out of your morning to learn about our new research product. And we look forward to presenting it in the future, but most certainly today. So thank you. Phyllis, welcome.
Thank you, and I'll extend my welcome to everyone as well. We're delighted to have you with us. I'm going to go ahead and quickly share my screen and see if I can minimize here, and let's make this a slideshow. And if you will indulge me a moment of personal reflection, since Henry got one, I'll take one too. I was thinking this morning about the sort of milestone of getting to this point of presenting what we're now calling the ColoradoCast, and how long in the making this was. And this is a project that actually started with the center about 5 years ago, with a conversation that my very close colleague at the time, Steve Fisher, I should give him the doctor title too, since he's earned it, and I were having about the fact that all the forecasting we did was long-term at the center, and wouldn't it be fun and interesting to have something that had a shorter term horizon, albeit a little scary as well. And we set out to build a model of leading economic indicators for the state. And as we started noodling on that, it evolved into what I'm going to share with you today. And the reason I bring this up is that we have been quietly watching this forecast for about 5 years now. In fact, we've been watching it for so long, I think Steve pretty much retired in the interim, but I believe he is on the line with us today. And before I start, it would be remiss if I didn't say thank you, Steve, for the intellectual partnership that has led to what I'm going to share today. So that background, I hope, will come up a couple times as we're talking, as I take you through what we see as the short-term outlook for the Colorado economy. So as Henry mentioned, we were pretty excited about working on this and getting a chance to share it, and looking forward to sharing it in the future, because we feel like this ColoradoCast fills a gap in the suite of forecasts that are currently available in the state. To our knowledge, everything has at least a 1-year horizon, although they're updated on a regular basis. And what we wanted to do is get a sense of the very short-term dynamics of the Colorado economy. So we set out to develop this model that has essentially a month-by-month, 6-month horizon. So the advantage of that is that it can highlight the sort of intra-year directional changes in the economy. It can pick up those subtle movements, hopefully subtle. You'll see in a moment that sometimes month-over-month movements are not subtle. And we see that it is an additional contribution to the economic indicators and the economic information that we get from the slightly longer term forecasts, and then of course the very long term, long range planning forecasts. So I have been playing around with this notion that economic analysis is not sort of a single point exercise, it's a mosaic, and this is a tile in that mosaic that takes you kind of closer to where we are today. I won't spend a lot of time here, but there's always someone who wants to geek out with me and get under the hood of this thing. And I will share with you just very briefly what we're doing here is we are forecasting a measure called the State Coincident Index for Colorado that comes from the Philadelphia branch of the Federal Reserve. That's a mouthful, so we call it the Philly Fed Index when we're working on this project. You may hear me slip and say that, I'll try and be careful, but if I talk about the Philly Fed Index, what I'm talking about is this coincident index. And a coincident index is a measure that's designed to essentially mimic the trend in GDP. And the reason that these coincident indices exist is because GDP is a significantly delayed economic metric. In fact, I believe I'm correct in saying that of all the economic measures we get throughout the sort of economic year, GDP is the most delayed of all those measures. So right now, if you went and you tried to find out GDP for Colorado, you could only find a measure that goes through Q2 of 2021. The Q3 data will not be available until December 23rd. And so if you want a more up-to-date measure of what's happening in the economy, you need something that's more timely than that. You don't want to wait 8 months to find out where we are. So coincident indices were developed so that you could get a peek at what's likely to be released once the GDP or the gross state product measures catch up. And so we have developed this model that essentially forecasts that Philly Fed coincident measure. So that measure comes out monthly, and we're saying, where is it likely to go for the next 6 months? And the way we're doing that is by using 6 variables to predict where that measure will go over the next 6 months. And you see them listed here. 4 of them essentially vary positively or move positively with the economy or with that Philly Fed index. At least we hypothesize or we predict that they will move positively. So as the yield spread widens, we would expect economic activity to be increasing, or that there's more economic optimism. As there's more employment in a very specific sector of the economy called the employment services sector, these are people who work at temporary agencies and so forth. Historically, as that group of employees has become larger, the economy is growing or becoming larger as well. The Wilshire 500, most of you probably know, is an equity index. So as that gets larger, we would predict that the economy would be getting larger, and housing prices as measured by the Case-Shiller index, we also hypothesize are moving positively with the economy. So as housing prices go up, we think the economy is in fact growing. There's 2 variables in the model that we predict would vary inversely with the economic activity in the state. The first one is initial claims for unemployment insurance. So as those go up, we predict that the economy should be declining, not rising. You don't expect more people to be applying for unemployment insurance in a time of economic growth. And a measure of risk premium, which is constructed using the return on corporate 10-year notes and the treasury, the sort of risk-free 10-year return. So the wider that gap, that's essentially a measure of some uneasiness or risk-on approach to the economy. So we would expect those 2 variables to be moving inversely. And so, as I mentioned, when Steve and I first sat down and thought about building an indicator list or developing a set of indicators to follow, this is where we started. And then we thought, well, why not go 1 step further and build a model to see how these 6 indicators vary with the economy and see if we can use that model to forecast. And so, in fact, that's what we did. And we sat on this model for a very long time because we were hoping to have an economic event that would allow us to see how well the model predicted. And we sat on it through probably 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, while the economy sort of chugged along in a very trending sort of way. And while we weren't hoping for a recession, we were perhaps perversely hoping for one because we wanted to see what it would do. And in fact, when we finally got one, that recession really had nothing to do with the economy. And so you see my title here that this model has demonstrated, we think, pretty positive predictive power. In fact, it's kind of surprised me how well it's done. However, no model's ever going to predict an event like COVID. And so, like I mentioned, when we finally got an economic event, it was a pandemic, and it wasn't a structural economic event that was caused by anything wrong with the economy. And so I will freely admit that if you watch the blue line there, which is the in-sample forecast, I'll talk about what that is in a moment. You can see that blue line, you can think of that as our forecast of the Philly Fed Coincident Index. And at the far end of that graphic, you can see in the green what actually happened. So we did not pick up the big decline that happened when we shut the entire economy down. I would be willing to argue that no model ever would have 6 months out. But once we return to the level of economic activity and a return toward re-emerging normal activity, the model has started to predict quite well. So what you're looking at here in the blue line is I essentially pretended that the world ended around 2008. And then I pretended that everything from 2008 forward was unknown to me, and I used our model to forecast what the ColoradoCast would have said about the Colorado economy had the world essentially ended at 2008. And then I compared it to what really happened. And so you can see that it was trending quite nicely until COVID, and now we appear to be back on a trajectory that's trending well again, which is why we decided that this was a nice point to start releasing this publicly with slightly more confidence that it will do a pretty good job over the 6-month forecast horizon. So with that, let me show you what we think is going to happen in the Colorado economy over the next 6 months. This graphic here is a very long-term time series. It starts in January of 2000 and it ends with our forecast in the bright concentric circles at the right. Our forecast begins where the line turns from gray to blue. And you can see that we expect the economy month over month to get bigger each month. I'm going to pause here for a second and let you reflect upon the fact that the state had a recession back in the early 2000s, and we had a wallop of a national recession in the state and the country. Actually, both of those were national recessions as well in 2008. And I'll ask you to remember how incredibly devastating the 2008, the Great Recession felt, and how almost minuscule it is on this graph relative to what happened when we shut the economy down for COVID. And so Steve and I would affectionately refer to this graph before COVID was on there as the rabbit ears, because you would see these two bumps and declines in the economy that now get completely dwarfed by what happened when we shut down for the pandemic. This section right here, which is our forecast, is blown up in this graphic here. And so you can see that we expect pretty steady continual growth in the Colorado economy over the ensuing 6 months. I think it's a little bit hard to interpret a graphic like this because it just looks like a trending line. So instead, we stated this as the annualized growth rate in the Colorado economy. Here you can see the bumps for the 2000-2001 tech recession and the Great Recession. And again, in magnitude, how incredibly devastating the shutdown, and then really how robust the bounce back return was. And you can see that our model now is predicting basically a return to more sort of trend, maybe a little bit high end trend growth rates. If we blow that up, this is what those growth rates look like month over month in our forecast. So you can see that we are certainly in a growth mode in the Colorado economy. We don't expect that to change, but compared to the end of this year, we expect the rate of growth heading into the early part of 2022 to slow, but certainly not to the rate where the Colorado economy would decline. How are our factors impacting that? It turns out that the 4 factors that are driving our forecast of continued growth are the ones you see here with the green up arrows. So the factors that are most significantly driving the increase in our forecast are the slightly steepening of the yield curve, the corporate risk spread kind of being in a more risk off kind of position, the Wilshire 500, the equity markets continuing to grow, and something that's probably no surprise to any of us in Colorado is home prices continuing to grow. I do want to point out that the Case-Shiller index is slightly delayed in the timing of its release. And so we do have to forecast a couple of months in there. The 2 measures that you see with the sort of yellow neutral indicator on them are the employment services sector, which doesn't seem to be having a strong impact on our forecast, and initial claims for unemployment, which are not correlating all that well with our model and forecast right now. I think because there's so much disruption happening in the labor market. And so we're going to watch that one over the next quarters pretty carefully. The blue lines in these graphics are the essentially year-to-date 2021, what we call spark lines. They just show you the general direction that each one of these variables is taking. So we're in a fairly positive, robust position relative to the next 6 months, largely because of the 4 variables that you see in green there that are driving the forecast up. I will close quickly here with a recognition that talking about the pattern of growth in a vacuum sometimes can be a little bit unsatisfying. So what I will share with you here is how this forecast has changed relative to, remember I said we were in a quiet period for many years. The last quarter of our quote quiet period with this was Q3 of 2021, which in both of these graphics is in green. And the two graphs here, I'll point your attention more to the one on the right, which shows the annualized growth rates, show you how our forecast has changed from when we ran it in the Q3 of 2021 to the one I'm sharing with you as our official release, which is the Q4. And you can see that relative to what our forecast was in the Q3, the Q4 is still showing, like I said, healthy growth, but it has come off a little bit from where we would have been had we released in the Q3. And so while the economy is still growing, what we're finding is that our forecast is suggesting that that rate of growth is slowing perhaps a little bit. The Q3 forecast very likely reflected a lot of that exuberance we all had about the deployment of vaccines, the economy reopening. And I think now there's some very slight headwinds happening from what has ensued since the early part of the spring and summer. So with that, I'll close with just some high-level takeaways and then look forward to having a conversation. According to this forecast that we are releasing today, economic activity has rebounded, at least as measured by the Philly Fed Index as of September 2021. So that index in September 2021 reached the level that it was at prior to COVID. We expect to see the economy continue to grow. To our April 2022 forecast is about a 6.45% annualized growth rate in the Colorado economy. Relative to an earlier, that Q3 2021 forecast, the Colorado economy is growing slightly slower than we would have forecast had we released in the Q3, yet the growth remains strong. I don't think it's time to run for the hills or anything like that, but that slight slowing in the forecast does suggest that, there's perhaps some concern about the pandemic enduring, the issues around the supply chain, which were emerging and are continuing to be a concern throughout the summer and fall. Other labor market stresses, and I don't have on this graphic too, perhaps the impact of inflation and what that's going to mean in terms of macroeconomic response. We don't have a slide in here, but we will continue to model and to release quarterly. We're sort of on an odd quarterly release schedule. We had hoped for this one to be in November, and it got delayed for a couple of reasons that had nothing to do with anything external. It had to do with some scheduling within the center. But we are looking to have a yearly release schedule of November, February, what would that be? November, February, March, April, May, and then August. So November, February, May, and August, you can expect to see the first, second, third, and Q4 updates each year to the ColoradoCast. I will bookend my presentation again with another robust thank you to Steve for his partnership on this, and leave you with the relevant information for getting in touch with us about this or any of our other research. And I will let you know that following our event today, there will be a report, flyer, template that will essentially summarize everything I presented. It will be available on the Future Site website, which you see there. It will also be available on a page on the CSU system website. and you will receive an email directing you to where you can go to find that information. So with that, I will take myself off of screen share, and I have not been monitoring the Q&A or the chat while I was speaking, but I believe Henry has, and so we'll invite him back to moderate any questions or conversation that we want to have going forward.
Phyllis, thank you for that presentation. It was great to walk through that and see the different variables and their relationship to the index, also the in-sample forecasts, for people who've done any forecasting. It's fascinating to see that. I don't have any open questions typed up in our chat. I forgot to ask people to do that as we were listening and learning, but to the extent there are those, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. Phyllis, I'll start you off if you don't mind. Can you give a sense of what our initial thoughts were, the government and maybe business or maybe journalistic uses of the ColoradoCast statistic and how it might play a role in public or business or policy life in Colorado?
Yeah, we've been noodling on this for a long time, and I think actually the most obvious use would be perhaps for business, because while in government we tend to think annual budgets and we will certainly make mid-year corrections if something very dramatic happens, we don't tend to move. Government tends to be more of a barge than a speedboat. But business needs to be, and probably should be, far more agile in its responses. And so we believe that having this, sort of month over month sense of certainly, is there going to be a sort of major turn in the economy? But if not, just a sense of, will the current rate of growth continue? Are we expecting it to get more robust, in which case, business might expect even stronger activity, or is it slowing slightly? Therefore, business activity should continue to grow, but maybe not at the same rate. Will allow some businesses to do planning that maybe they otherwise couldn't do with what are otherwise annual forecasts. And so we probably saw that as sort of the major consumer of this forecast, the business sector. However, thankfully, we're not in a position like that right now, but we could be here 2 or 3 years from now. Hopefully it's longer than that, but who knows, where the forecast is actually suggesting a recession. And if that were the case, or a significant slowdown in economic activity that's not a recession, and if that were the case, then I think it becomes relevant for government as well, because those are the situations in which then government really needs to think about what its responses are going to be. If you see an indication of a pretty significant slowdown, that would suggest a pretty significant decline in tax revenue. I think, Henry, you've probably had times sitting under the Gold Dome where you were frantically responding to circumstances like that. And then government does need to try and be more of that speed ship than the barge. And so we really see it as relevant for all sectors. I think in times of more trend growth, it's probably more relevant in the business sector than the public sector.
Thank you. We have 2 questions. They came across, I'll just do them in order. The first question is it accurate to say that Colorado's economy has fully recovered from the pandemic, considering it's seeing pre-pandemic economic activity since September 2021?
I always hesitate with questions like this. And so the short answer is, by the headline macro statistics, you would have to say yes. My concern about saying yes to something like that really is almost connected to the sort of other hat the center wears, where we look at issues around socioeconomics and the impact on families in Colorado, and the distributional impacts of how the economy affects a household relative to how the headline statistics portray an economy. And my concern with saying yes is that while at the headline level, in most cases, we have fully recovered, I believe we're still below on employment, but the employment recovery is projected to happen sometime in the 2022 calendar year. There are sectors of the economy, and there are sectors of, there are certain demographic units in our state that have not fully recovered. And so while I can wear my sort of macro fiscal hat and say, yes, we've had this very significant recovery, the headline statistics show it, the graphics show it, I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that it's not even. And so the answer to that question is probably more nuanced than most people want for a headline, but the headline would be that while the macro economy has recovered, there are certainly sectors and some Coloradans who are very much still feeling the pain of the pandemic recession.
Thank you. You alluded to the second question, but maybe a little bit more on it. The question is, can you talk about the gap between GDP recovery and job recovery?
Yeah. And so again, economic events can create, certainly they create disruptions. They can create sort of reorganizations of the way we organize ourselves economically. And so let me pick on something like the airline industry. While we might say the economy has fully recovered, and by those headline measures it's fully recovered, it's not clear that business travel will ever recover to the level it was. It certainly may, but there's a lot of sort of head scratching around. We've all gotten very used to doing this. So I will admit it was pretty simple to get up this morning and get dressed and hop on a screen instead of getting dressed, driving in my car, driving to Denver, finding a parking space, walking into a room. You see where I'm going. And if you extend that globally, if people can do this instead of getting on a plane and flying to Geneva for a 4-hour meeting, it's very likely that some people will continue to do that. And so we will likely see sectors that are very exposed to that notion of how we reorganize ourselves economically that are lagging in their recovery and in fact may never recover the way they to the way they looked before the recession began. And so I think until this full sort of play out of how we reorganize ourselves economically happens, we will see some disconnects between labor markets and the headline GDP numbers, because we're moving around the places and the ways that economic activity is happening.
Okay, another question came in as you were talking. How is inflation reflected in the GDP values?
Well, I'm not sure what that question relates to with respect to our forecast.
So is the coincident index in nominal values?
The coincident index will track real GDP. So that's what I was going to say. When you look at a GDP measure, there's what's called real GDP and nominal GDP. And real GDP essentially corrects for inflation. Nominal GDP will grow with inflation. And the coincident index is designed to trend real. So essentially we're factoring out the impact of inflation and we're looking at projected real growth in the economy.
Okay, I hope that was a satisfying answer to the questioner. Don't have other questions here. Phyllis, is there anything you meant to say during your slides that you didn't get to and it reoccurred to you?
I don't think so. The thing I probably fumbled over the most was because I think we perhaps missed a slide announcing that this will be a quarterly release. We weren't intending to just do this once and then leave it hanging. And what we'll do each quarter is we will essentially tie it back to the quarter before by having that comparative slide that I showed you to the unreleased Q3. And we will then archive each one of those releases on our website. And so over time, they will create essentially a sort of longitudinal look at what we thought about the economy. And so I would just make a pitch that we may not do a very formal webinar release each quarter, but we hope that you will sort of have it in your mind that every quarter we will have an update to this shorter term outlook that will, over time sort of present a picture on what has happened and what we think will happen with the economy. So I probably didn't make that clear enough, but we hope you will join us in some way again in February when we update the model and have our Q1 2022 release.
Great. I didn't see more questions come in, and from my point of view, I just want to say we got a list of the attendees from our great team that helped us put on this event today. Tiana Nelson, Jen Smith, and Adam Federer, and a lot of our government partners, either in state government or in city and county government, were on. Some journalists from different publications and websites. So we certainly did get a scan of our intended audience, and we hope this was a useful first experience with the ColoradoCast. We're really looking forward to continuing this conversation and adding to the mosaic, as Phyllis talks about, of making sense of what's happening now and what's happening down the road in Colorado economic activity. So Phyllis, I think we might be able to give the gift of time from our schedule, unless there's more to contribute. My deep appreciation to you and Jen, and my thanks to the attendees for taking time out of their day today for learning about our new research product.
And I will echo that. Thank you.